Hello everyone, welcome to The Students. I'm your host, Wolf Tivy. I'm here with Rachel Wallis,
Hello.
one of my esteemed colleagues who's at the forefront of reproductive technology. She's very interested in those things. She ran a Reproductive Frontiers conference recently. We're here to talk, we're going to have a little debate, which is, should you use these cutting edge genetic reproduction technologies on your own children? Or should you do it the old-fashioned way? And so I represent the old-fashioned way. I have 4 children, 5 on the way, done au naturel, as you might say, and she's engaged in full-on embryo selection experiments. So we're going to have this conversation. We're going to figure it out, and let us begin.
Fantastic. I'm so excited to have this conversation because I know that we've sort of like danced around the topic a decent amount just in passing, and obviously I really respect you as a thinker, and so the idea that you're sort of not potentially anti-reproductive technology, but sort of represent an opposing view is very interesting. But so I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, okay, I'll start with the opening argument, which is that our ancestors have been doing this a certain way for 4 billion years, thereabouts. It's hard to know, you look at the genetic record, it can be a little fuzzy that far back, at least 1 billion years, for sexual reproduction, at least. And it's very well proven, it's very Lindy, as you might say. As for sort of, so we know it works, and this is my general philosophy with reproduction is, we have anti-aging technology, we have immortality technology that actually just works. It's called reproduction. Mm-hmm. You can just make more of yourself, and there's a certain thing you can do to increase variation and quality, which is to mix with someone else. So, it's all very convenient and well designed. I am a big fan of sexual reproduction.
Yeah, probably
as a system.
It's always going to be the most anti-fragile of all immortality technologies, because if you simply remain yourself forever, that's probably not going to be optimal.
You're opening yourself up to big wipeouts. This is why actually that non-sexually reproducing, asexual reproducing species often get wiped out, or lineages will get wiped out in favor of sexual lineages. But that's a whole other set of discussions. Now, bringing it forward to the 21st century, and in some ways the 20th century as well. People started experimenting with chemical birth control and whatnot. The question is, given new technology, why should we stick with an old technology? My first argument is I don't want to be the guinea pig.
Fair.
These things, well, on paper, we might be able to do some crazy embryo selection stuff and get an additional standard deviation of intelligence or courage or health or whatever it is that we're going for. That's all unproven, right? It's speculative at this point. I look forward to the results, but it's speculative. And so that's reason number one is just, okay, out of general caution, I don't think there's going to be any takeoff, winner takes all effect here. So general caution, I'll sit back and wait till we see the results. Point number two is I find it very, it's obviously very invasive into the sort of the whole life of the whole life cycle of the human being. We're now inserting this techno-capital apparatus into the most fundamental aspect of life in a way that not only is sort of a little bit questionable, creates dependencies and so on, but it also disrupts. I mean, people give these vague kind of spiritual arguments, like does it affect the relationship between the parents and the child? Does it reflect the relationship between the parents and each other? I think there's something to those arguments. I'm not going to say those are fully rational or anything like that. I think there's something there. And maybe if I can try to articulate it rationally, there's you're fundamentally changing your relationship to life. And it's important to always think through not only how am I doing things and what's the appropriate thing on the margin, but what kind of society does this imply? What kind of world does this imply? What kind of lifestyle does this imply? If me and my community are doing this, or if I'm doing this differently from the rest of my community, what does that look like? Mm-hmm. And for those, I find that the reproductive technologies, it's a little bit, again, it's speculative, right? You're throwing a lot of stuff up in the air that had previously been quite fixed. And so let's see where it goes. And then I always, it is my habit to reason into the extremes. This is something that I like to do. And so what is the extreme in terms of reproductive technology? Well, we start with this embryo selection stuff. We start with some genetic modification. In the limit, though, then now we're talking about okay, we've got artificial wombs or disembodied wombs, where they take some dead girl's womb and strap it up to a machine and make it produce children. People are doing experiments with things like this.
Yeah.
You end up with a totally different nature of what man is, right? And combine that with genetic modification, we're talking an entirely different animal.
Yeah.
And there's no longer any constraints on head size. There's no longer any constraints on almost any dimension. We start to really explore the wacky stuff. And I'm not against any of that. I find it fascinating. I like, the idea of life unleashing itself on all different dimensions and becoming something better.
Yeah.
Hopefully something better. However, again, there's a lot of risk in these highly speculative technologies. And I'm always curious to know how the advocates of reproductive technologies and so on are thinking about those more limiting cases. If not conservatism, then where do you see it going, right?
Yeah.
And so through all of these arguments and just a general distrust of the medical system, I have chosen to do things the proper way, the old way.
Look, it's a lot of fun. I can't blame you.
Right. And so that's my opening argument. We've set the hostile tone for you to come in here and articulate your views. So let's hear it. Why should we, throw out the old ways and do our reproduction with the machine, so to speak?
Absolutely. I'm just going to take 1 second to look up a name, or maybe you remember, what was the name of the guy who discovered that stomach ulcers are caused by bacteria?
I don't recall, but I do recall the case where people thought, stomach ulcers, they're caused by stress, they're caused by genetics, there's something toxins, blah, blah, blah. And it turns out the people who take antibiotics lose the stomach ulcers. And there's a whole bunch of other things like this, certain kind of spinal problems, certain kinds of even, I think, multiple sclerosis or something may have recently been shown to be a pathogen.
Really? Oh, interesting.
And I'm not sure if it's that one or if it's another one of those sort of mysterious autoimmune kind of nervous system disorders. But something like that was recently shown similarly to be a pathogen.
His name is Barry Marshall, and the reason I bring him up is because I remember reading about him in high school, and he was having a whole lot of trouble convincing people of his theory. And so he basically took a beaker full of the bacteria and downed it, and then gave himself stomach ulcers.
Oof. Did he then take a load of antibiotics and cure it?
He did.
I would hope so.
But he ended up winning the Nobel Prize for medicine. But I remember it just
self-experimentation.
Yeah, it's so based. I'm just this is exactly who I want to be.
Right. Okay. So you're into sort of high-risk self-experimentation.
And look, I think that when you do any kind of sales or investigation into sort of population psychology, there's definitely a group called the first adopters, and then there are secondary adopters, third adopters, and so you kind of have this bell curve. And I actually think it's probably evolutionary advantageous that you have whenever something new happens, the vast majority of the population is immediately suspicious, and then you have a certain group who are hell yeah, I'm going to try this. And
well, this is necessary to life. You have some variation in how people approach things, so that you try out these experiments. God rolls the dice a little bit, and we see where it goes. But of course, it's high risk.
It is. It is. And look, psychologically, I'm definitely in the early adopter category, and this is true of basically everything in my life. But as well as that, I do have a special interest in biology and medicine. I remember being 10 years old and watching House MD with my parents. And it was my job in the family that basically every episode they had this thing called the brain drill, where they'd have to probably drill into the patient's brain, and they'd show it on the screen, and my parents would go, "Oh God!" And it would be my job to tell them when the brain drill was over, because I would be like, "Oh yeah, this is cool."
You were watching it with great interest.
And so I love all things biology and medical, and it doesn't actually freak me out that much. And so in many ways, I'm sort of the perfect candidate for something like polygenic embryo selection, where I'm a I'm excited for the results of the technology, obviously, but actually the mechanics of it and like the drugs and the titrations and the entire process and going into
the whole machine. Yeah.
It makes me,
So,
I find it so exciting.
Speaking of brain drills, have you done trepanation then?
No, not yet. Never say never.
That's of course where they drill a hole in your skull to let out the evil spirits and or the pressure or something.
It was
practiced by ancient South Americans.
In the Near East as well. I think there's evidence of it in sort of Egypt and stuff. But it's one of the first surgeries that we did, and extremely good for relieving pressure if you've got a brain bleed. You know, the ancients, they weren't dumb.
I mean, did they have an MRI system? How do they know what's in there?
I don't know how they figured it out, but it's pretty obvious that if a person like has a brain injury, they kind of seem fine, and then they pass out. That's typically a sign that they're like have too much intracranial pressure. And so the ancients may have figured out that like in some cases, if you drill a hole and it like the blood comes out, they wake up. And so maybe they put it together. Anyway, sorry, that's slightly off topic.
That is definitely a tangent. But okay, so you're into sort of biological self-experimentation.
Yes. And look, hugely into the peptides craze and everything. So I think I'm almost a perfect candidate to be the sort of the vanguard to try out these technologies, and then if it works for everybody else, then I think it'll be great.
You sacrifice yourself for the race by throwing yourself into the biological futurism.
And look, some people may say like, oh, you know, it's perfectly okay for you to do self-experimentation on yourself, but doing it on your children is potentially a step too far.
Right. So tell me more about that.
Well, so one thing I would say is that we already, for the most part, think that the parents are probably the best people to think about what their children would actually want before they reach the age of majority. And I think that makes sense as a supposition because those are generally the people who are closest to them biologically. They probably share a lot of the same dispositions.
We do generally love our children.
Also, we love our children. We absolutely have their best interests at heart. But you know, my husband and I are we're not exactly sort of shy and retiring people. I think we're both into sort of big experimentation, and so I suspect our children will probably be similar. And I sort of think like if my parents had the opportunity to experiment biologically on me to make me smarter or healthier, and I found out that they didn't do it, I would be so mad. And so my hope is that my children will have a similar disposition to me.
Well, yeah, one hopes. And
I would also say just a little bit about polygenic. You know, I'm saying all of these things like, oh, it's, you know, it's super dangerous, it poses a risk to the children. This technology is basically super IVF and doesn't pose
why don't you
any,
give us an overview of what exactly it is that is the cutting edge and what you are doing.
Yes. So basically, IVF is where you get a sperm and an egg and you put them together in a dish outside the body. It forms an embryo and then you put it back in a womb. And so this was kind of invented by a very clever person as a way to bypass sort of primary reproduction, because a lot of stuff can go wrong. You know, you can have a blocked tube, or maybe the partner's sperm don't have enough motility, but actually like the genetic material is fine. And so it sort of bypasses a lot of things that can go wrong with reproduction. And then more recently, we invented a way to take a look at the embryo to sort of have a high level understanding of if it's genetically viable. And so this is something called PGTA, or pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy. Aneuploidy being if it has too many or too few chromosomes. And so basically how this works is that once you grow up the embryo in the petri dish, it's several hundred cells. You take maybe a sample of 5 to 10 cells, and this is like completely fine for the embryo. And then you send those away to a lab. You do a very low read genetic analysis on it, and because it's so low read and so low resolution, you can't really make out individual genes, but you can see chromosomes basically, and you can be like, well, unfortunately this embryo has 4 extra chromosomes. It's probably not going to work out if we implant it.
Right.
But in even more recently than that, we have discovered something called PGTP, which is basically where you can take the whole genome sequence of mum and dad, so a long read, very granular look at all of their different genes, and then you combine this knowledge with the low read PGTA test, so like looking at the chromosomes. And you can basically, because you can see the chromosomes, you can see which chromosome has been inherited from which parent for the baby. And so you can make a prediction as to its genetic makeup.
And is the inheritance by chromosomes, or are there crossings otherwise than the chromosomes?
Yes, and so this is the tricky thing, is like getting the crossing over. So for the general audience, basically what happens, one of the magical parts of sexual reproduction is that you get in the embryo the chromosomes from mum and dad line up. You get one set of chromosomes from mum, one set of from dad, and then there is a random amount of what's called crossing over, where the chromosomes literally cross over like this, and they break off and they form actually new chromosomes. And this is part of the reason why you can inherit unequal parts of DNA from your grandparents. So I've done ancestry DNA, and I know that I share, I think, 27% of my genome with my maternal grandmother, and only 23% from my maternal grandfather, I think, from crossing over, which I think is really interesting. Anyway, sorry, that's also a tangent.
Yeah, that is interesting.
But it turns out with math and a lot of very clever thinking, you can figure out the crossing over. And so these, the PGTP, or polygenic embryo selection, you can see, I think, to like probably 99.5% accuracy of the embryos, which is enough to be able to then look at the embryos and do the next step, which is actually the most difficult part of the process, and is the part where there's the most potential for improvement, which is to make predictions about the future of the child based on its genes.
Right, and you use this sort of, people have developed statistical methodologies for telling from a genome, how tall is this person, what color hair, what color eyes, what maybe even some personality dispositions, their intelligence, obviously health things like various genetic diseases.
Yeah, and so you can basically, you'll be able to see, for the most part, monogenic diseases, I believe. And so that's great. You can avoid things like Tay-Sachs, or I know I'm a carrier for something called hereditary hemochromatosis, which is sometimes called the Irishman's disease, which I'm thankfully a carrier, so a heterozygote as opposed to homozygote, which means if I had 2 copies of the bad gene instead of 1, it means that you don't get rid of iron properly. And so the solution to this is not actually a life-threatening disease. It just means that you have to have regular exsanguination in order to get rid of your excess iron stores.
You have to give blood more often.
So I thought that was interesting, but luckily
I've heard actually that most people should be doing that, but
to get rid of the microplastics. Maybe the ancients.
But even for the iron.
Actually, for the iron, but also the 2 big ways to get rid of microplastics, I think, are regular exsanguination and sauna. But anyway, sorry, these are also tangents.
Right.
But basically, where was I going? You can get rid of monogenic disease, and then you can also get rid of what's called polygenic disease, which is conditions that are caused by either multiple genes or interactions between the genes. And so some of the predictors are now extremely accurate, depending on how heritable the condition is and how simple the condition is. So I have done this for my own embryos, and so I have a little thing on my computer that I can look at from the polygenic embryo screening company, and I can select different embryos, and I can see how tall they're going to be. And so the height
if they're fed well.
If they're fed well. So height is extremely heritable and easy to predict, basically their maximum height. And obviously it can be lower if they're not given enough nutrients, which I think is very interesting. So height is generally very heritable. Certain things like schizophrenia are extremely heritable, and so that's a wonderful thing to be able to look at. Thankfully, Jonathan, my husband, and I aren't very predisposed to schizophrenia. He's a little bit higher than I am, and then our embryos, I think even our highest schizophrenia risk one is not very likely to get schizophrenia, and so that's not really something we're going to select for.
Well,
but if your family has a history of schizophrenia, that would be extremely important.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question why schizophrenia sticks around, and this maybe gets into some of the practicalities of do you really want to do these kinds of selections, because schizophrenia, it probably sticks around as sort of an extreme expression of something that's actually good.
Yeah.
And so you have the most extreme expression, you kind of go crazy, you can't quite hold your life together, you can't quite tell what's real. In the less extreme expressions, you're really, really good at pattern matching, you're really, really good at figuring out what's going on, piecing together the subtle things. Yeah. And my family, I think, has a history of schizophrenia actually, but also a history of photographic memories,
cool.
Genius level kind of pattern matching ability. Sick. And so on. and those things I think are inseparable.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious how you make, or how you think about those let's say more, ultimately a lot of these choices are in fact value laden, right? And
Yeah.
where do the values come from? What grounding do you have to be able to make that decision? And this is, again, I like to think into the extremes, in the limit of full genetic self-authorship, the actual sort of thing that becomes the repository of the reality of your life is like your ideology or your worldview, right?
Yes.
Which ultimately also comes from your genetics at some level.
It's self-reinforcing, yeah.
It's self-reinforcing. So you get this kind of new feedback loop between genetics and worldview. And curious how you've thought about those issues and what level of caution or kind of deliberate randomness or versus like, do you want to be fully rationalist and go and poke every bit?
Something you're describing is referred to as antagonistic pleiotropy. And so
Right.
it's the idea that in trying to select for something good, you might accidentally select for something bad. And so one of the polygenic embryo screening companies, Heresight, has it's something that they're really concerned about. And so they recently released a paper on it to be like, of all these traits that we think parents are going to want to select for, are any of these accidentally going to select for negative things? And I think the big worry is that for selecting is for something as complex as intelligence, are you also selecting for other things? There's a sort of stereotype of the sort of the mad professor or the depressed genius. Does genius come with a certain kind of madness? Who's to say? But they found that actually when you look into and look, this is all using the predictors that we have, which are perhaps still in their infancy. But as far as we can tell, intelligence is not really associated with any bad outcomes. In fact, it's associated with a lot of decreases in bad mental health markers. So highly intelligent people are less likely to be anxious, less likely to be depressed. There's a question of, are they actually less predisposed to these things, or is it simply that being more intelligent allows you to live an easier life, and so you're less likely to
well,
get...
I think I'll make the case for why intelligence, like for let's say background optimism here, which is that the edge cases I'm talking about with things like schizophrenia, those are the edge cases. The main case is there is such a thing as health, right?
Yes.
And the healthier you are, the smarter you are, the more athletic you are, the more charismatic you are. There's actually, and the way that shows up genetically, now I'm not an expert in the details here, but what I understand is that there's a certain level of kind of mutational load, which is to say random little mutations that run in families that attack certain functionalities in your system and lead to degraded performance. And if you have too many of these things, you're unhealthy, you're stunted, you're not intelligent, maybe your brain doesn't work as well, you have a bit of mental illness. And if you just got rid of that stuff, you suddenly become, the sort of back to the Garden of Eden, like the perfect man, right?
Yeah, this is absolutely true. An interesting thing about this is, men and women, both their gametes kind of degrade as they age. So we all know as women get older, it can become harder to produce a euploid embryo. So euploid is the opposite of aneuploid. Euploid means an embryo with the correct number of chromosomes.
I see.
So if you have the eggs of a 25-year-old woman and you're doing IVF, she will produce a larger number of euploid embryos. If you're, say, 40, you're getting down to maybe 10 to 15% of the embryos that you create will be euploid. But the interesting thing about this is that a embryo from a 40-year-old woman is probably going to be as good as the embryo from a 25-year-old woman. So they're harder to make.
Assuming that they pass these tests.
As long as it's got the correct number of chromosomes, they're basically going to be as healthy with each other. This is not the case with men. So men are capable of producing euploid embryos right up until their old age. But the issue is that sperm gets a lot more mutations as men get older. And so even though men are equally as capable as making children in their old age, the children will be of a slightly worse quality. And I don't want to say that because, lots of people have old fathers and they're functional and happy members of society, but on average,
it's just on average, these are the things that build up over the course of generations.
But I thought that was very interesting, and you're right. So mutational load really does play a factor in things, and there is a sort of a model of health is maybe like not so much that you have like all of the best genes, but you're just lacking in the really deleterious ones. But sort of to get back to this idea of antagonistic pleiotropy, they found that intelligence is mostly associated with like mostly good things. On the margins, there might be a slight chance of if you're like higher at IQ. You have a slightly increased risk of Asperger's, so not full-blown, like unable to speak autism, but like predisposition towards enjoying trains, that kind of autism. And slightly, it seems that women who are higher IQ are at slightly increased risk of anorexia, which is also another interesting thing. But the one trait that they found that actually has a decent amount of antagonistic pleiotropy is height. So it turns out that I think the optimal height is actually something like for men it's like 5'10" or 5'11", and then
how do we measure optimal here?
So men basically, as you get taller and taller, it puts a greater strain on your cardiovascular system, and so taller men tend to have increased cardiovascular problems, and they don't live as long.
So for pure longevity.
And you could say, look, I'm here for a good time, not a long time,
Yes,
I'd love, you sort of like, actually, I'd choose to be the 6'6" Chad, and maybe like die in my 60s as opposed to, I don't know, 5'9" and make it to 80. But I thought it's interesting that this corresponds slightly with the fact that I think that the special forces tend to prefer men who are around that height. And I think it might be more that it has to do with the ratio of like body strength to body weight, in that like if everyone's kind of 5'10", it's like easy to carry a comrade if they're hurt, but also they can carry you. Or something like that.
And then so like making these value judgments between like what do we actually want here. This opens up all these interesting questions about like
what do you actually?
You're entangling your worldview and so on in the genetic process itself, which is this is itself a very interesting topic. We could go deep on that.
Yeah, and I do think that it's sort of like I totally understand the idea of Chesterton's fence, and that you should be sort of wary about taking down fences that you perhaps don't completely understand, and perhaps assuming that you understand it all is kind of an act of hubris. But at the same time, I don't know. I'm kind of excited for a future where people's worldviews are even more entangled in the way that they live their lives and the way that their children live their lives. I think it's like you want to live your life as an experiment and to have your style and substance in everything you do. And so to me, it feels like a type of self-actualization.
Yeah, well, life definitely is an experiment. That is true. God is running an experiment by bringing you into existence. Is this one going to work? Is this
We'll
one
see.
going to work? Yeah, and it's sort of like as we take more of an active role in that, we are having to kind of elevate ourselves to do those experiments ourselves, to run those experiments and say what's actually going to be a good experiment to run, right? Because that's the mindset you have to have with children. Is it's not I'm trying to create the perfect person. I mean, obviously you want to move towards creating the perfect person to some degree, but also what kind of experiments do we want to run for, which kind of person actually is the perfect person or a better person for right now in this niche or whatever.
I'd say that this is why I think polygenic, we can get into all the other reproductive technologies later, but I think polygenic embryo selection is kind of the perfect beginning, because it's, I currently have 50 euploid embryos, and so I'm hopefully going to do a transfer next month and hopefully be pregnant with my first child. I'm just so excited.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Pre-congratulations.
Pre-congratulations.
It all becomes very strange when these things are planned out 6 months in advance.
So I've sort of been intellectually pregnant with this child for like the past 9 months, and then there's going to be the actual pregnancy. But it's, what was I going to say? Yes, but they are still 50 of my and my husband's children. And so it's not like we've genetically modified any of them. It's simply that we've like pushed the probabilities one way or the other.
Yeah, you've prioritized them.
Yeah, and so...
So yeah, let's speak about that, because, when people have these different, let's call them spiritual attachments to various ways of seeing these things. Like obviously if you bring into existence 50 embryos, those are children that you may or may not be able to have. Most probably you will not be able to have all of them. Yeah. And it makes it very real. And it makes that choice between, like, you have to prioritize between your children now. Yeah. It's like, which ones do we want to bring into the world and which ones aren't going to make it? And how do you see the responsibility of that? I know a lot of people are against IVF and especially these like embryo selection things because it seems to involve the conception of many human beings if you believe that there's some kind of implantation of a soul. I don't really think that way, but you know, people bring up these arguments, and I wonder how you think about that.
Absolutely. I think I could do the easy argument and say like, oh, you know, an embryo is not a child, and we shouldn't accord it the same moral value. And I don't think I actually believe that.
I don't believe that either.
Do I think it's morally exactly the same as a child? No, but I definitely think that there's a strange sort of in between that it is quite morally fraught. And it's interesting because going into this process, I was, I think, a little bit cavalier, and I was just like, oh, I'm going to make all these embryos and I'm going to select the one that I think has the best chance of a fabulous life, and it's all going to be wonderful. And I remember waking up from my first egg retrieval and getting the egg retrieval results told to me, and sort of feeling like this immense attachment to all of these little embryos.
Right. Those are my children.
These are my kids, and I've worked so hard for to create them, and I've longed for them for so long. I have a thing in my Apple Notes on my phone. It is my embryo list, and it has everything that I know about each individual embryo. And sometimes I'll just open it and I will look through the embryos and sort of commune with them. I know this sounds absolutely crazy.
No, but they're your children.
They are.
But it puts you in this very tough position as a mother, right? Of like, I have to prioritize between my children.
Yeah, and I would also sort of caveat all of this by saying that I think your relationship to this process is so different for everyone. And so I'm not saying that like all women or men who do IVF should have this relationship at all, and I have zero judgment of how anybody else goes through the process. I'm just explaining my position. But I now have this kind of attachment to all of these embryos, and I think that like I would actually quite like all of them to come into existence if that's possible.
Right.
And so I've had quite a few discussions with my husband Jonathan, and it's like, okay, I don't know if we can have 50 children and give them all the best life.
Yeah, that's going to be just
difficult
be a lot for various reasons.
I would also say that an embryo is not a child simply in terms of probability. So the really sad thing is that each embryo, depending on the grade, has a chance of a live birth. And so if you have the perfect embryo, so a 4 AA perfectly graded euploid, you have the world's best receptive uterus, the lining is all perfect, an amazing doctor, you go to do the transfer, the chance of a live birth from that is somewhere between 65 to 70%. So it's actually not very high.
It's reasonably high, but that's still a lot of attrition.
And it's extremely, it makes this entire polygenic embryo journey a lot harder when you're sort of like, okay, I've done all this work, I've spent all this money, I've done all these injections, I have got my perfect embryo. It's like, we're predicted to be the Kwisatz Haderach who will change worlds. And then you go to implant it and it doesn't work. And it's just like,
you lost that one.
Yeah. And so we haven't reached that stage yet, but fingers crossed. But I would say that, so we've got 50 embryos, and that's for a perfect embryo. For less perfect embryos, it's usually under 50%. And so I've actually done the statistical analysis of all these kids, embryos depending on their particular rates of live births, and I think it's probably going to result in more like 32 live births on average. There's still a lot of children, probably, that my husband and I are not going to be able to raise ourselves.
Yes.
And so I think we've come to the decision that what we would actually like to do is probably donate the ones that we don't use. And so the interesting thing is that the demand for embryos is actually a lot higher than the current supply.
Right.
And I think
because there's infertile couples or various circumstances where people do want a child, but they can't get one otherwise.
Yeah, and I think for most people, I think it is extremely, they're uncomfortable with the idea of another family raising their genetic child, which I totally understand. It's deeply uncomfortable for me as well. And I say that like I'm smiling, and I don't want people to think I'm like a psychopath, because sometimes I smile when I'm uncomfortable. But it, like and I do worry. I'm like, will they do right by these children? But I eventually come back to the idea that, I think I want to give them the chance if it's possible.
Yeah, give them the chance, right? I mean, one way that I've sort of thought about this previously is you kind of, not just embryos are children, but the counterfactual children you could have had are full moral persons, and you have to consider that. They are at as we speak, already lined up on the other side, waiting to come in, saying, don't knock on the door, mommy,
Yeah.
are you gonna please,
let me in?
don't forget me. And so you have to think that way as well. I think that's the most correct. I think the attempts to like place ensoulment at some particular material fact is a way to avoid responsibility actually for counterfactuals.
Yeah.
And I think we do have to take responsibility for things. I mean, this is what I find sort of, I'm supposed to be taking somewhat of the opposition here, but I actually find sort of compelling about this whole line of thought is that this is a way to actually take more responsibility for what we're doing. And I know some people like to avoid the responsibility, like to say, okay, we're going to leave it in the hands of nature, in the hands of God. I don't want to be saddled with that moral weight of having to make that decision.
Yeah.
But
and this is
I think maturity as individuals and as a species involves kind of climbing that ladder to be able, I mean, some people will call it to play God, right? But basically to take more and more responsibility for the act of creation. Right?
And this is exactly the way that my husband and I think about it, and we've had this discussion of what we're doing is a kind of we've become morally culpable in a way that we wouldn't in the way that if we just did it the old-fashioned way.
Yeah, so you have to be very sober about that.
You do, and if I chose to discard them, there's some there's a kind of morally, it's in some ways like a powerful, perhaps a kind of a violent act. But if I choose to give away my children to other families, I can totally imagine that I think it's going to be really weird for the kids. I think they're going to grow.
It's going to be weird. I mean, a lot of people are going to be. Other people are going to be very uncomfortable about that.
Absolutely, and like my hope is that with the other families who we potentially give these embryos to, and I would absolutely be hands off and be like, look, you are the parents, you're going to be raising this child. I do care that the siblings be able to know each other, and so I would really like to potentially have an open relationship with the other families, and hopefully the kids can be like cousins and know each other. But I can totally imagine these kids, one of them growing up and being like, finding out about their story and being like, wow, I was given away because I wasn't good enough, and coming to me and Mom, or not mom, but you're this woman and you've decided to like make this choice in the pursuit of sort of the perfect child and sort of see me as a supervillain. And I absolutely am like, that child should be able to be angry at me. I would probably have like really, really complex feelings about it.
Yeah, and that's you see a lot of this with these, various sorts of experimental creative actions. I don't know, like in general. I mean, you see, obviously the crazy family of Elon Musk or other people like that who kind of do more unconventional things. You end up with these situations where, because you have acted out of the norm within social convention, you take on a lot more blame when something goes wrong, right? And or if someone grows up to be resentful, I generally don't think it's because of whatever they think it is. Like, it's just some people kind of turn out angry at the world in a way, and then they fixate on something, right? And for a lot of these kids, they're going to fixate on you, right? And it's going to be like, well, mom didn't want me, so this, it puts you in this really tough position again. And so this is what it means to take responsibility, is actually to confront those things, right? It's like the job of a king, right? In deciding the fate of his people is like, well, sometimes you have to make these really tough choices.
Yeah, and
and you have to be the one that takes the blame.
This is the way that I think about it. Is I'm not going to say to if any of these kids end up confronting me and being angry, I'm not going to say like you shouldn't think about it that way, or you have no right to be angry. I'll be like, yeah, like I can definitely see why you're upset. And I would also say, I am a big girl and I have big shoulders and I'm not afraid of taking on responsibility. And I think like I've kind of weighed the scenarios, and I am actually really excited for this kind of abundant future where hopefully there are 30 kids running around and they have like all of these siblings, and like hopefully one or two of them have incredible minds and go on to produce incredible things for the world, or
Right. And I mean the sort of counterpoint is, I wanted to give you a chance.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying. And I'm like,
because again, I think the attempt to avoid responsibility is incorrect.
Yeah, I agree.
And you do not, in fact, like, you may socially avoid responsibility, but you do not, in fact, avoid responsibility by like shying away from these decisions, or choosing not to have as many children or something. Or like you don't end up dodging that. Like those kids are still there on the other side, knocking at the door, saying, "Mommy, are you going to let me through?"
I could kind of do the easier thing of, it's terrible because it's like I should say to our ghostly audience, like I am going to live my life as an experiment, but I do not believe that the exceptional person should be the rule of society. And I absolutely am not saying that I think that this is the path for everyone, or like if you do polygenic embryo screening, like it is the correct thing to donate all these children. I feel like it is correct for me because I don't know, I think people have different relationships.
Someone has to pursue the experimental role in society.
And I have a particular relationship to these embryos, which is one of, I am absolutely excited and delighted to see how they all turn out. Maybe one of them that's like their supervillain or their origin story, and they're like, I was given away because I wasn't seen as good enough, and I'm going to use that fire to become like this, a titan of industry or a great artist, and then at the end they're going to go like, and fuck you, and I'm going to be like, this is amazing. Like this is, I totally understand.
You'd love to sort of by proxy give birth to some supervillain somewhere.
I know that sounds crazy, but I'm like, I love drama, I love life, I love vivacity. I don't want to live my life like making things smaller so that there's less conflict.
Right. No, I get this completely. Yeah. And so let's talk then about how do we judge them to be better or worse. Like you gave us a little bit of an overview on how these technologies work, but I want to follow through some of those technical things. So, for example, you said, okay, we can get a sort of 99% read on what the genetic makeup of the kid probably is. So one technical question, why is it easier to sequence the parents rather than those cells that you get from the embryo?
The answer is it's much easier to take a lot of cells from the parents because they have a lot of cells.
I see.
And so
you just get more rolls of the dice in these statistical processes.
And so basically what you have to do, there's a process called amplification when it comes to DNA. So when you take the 5 to 10 cells from the embryo, that's a really small amount of DNA. And so before you even take apart the DNA to read it, you have to do this process of amplification where you're actually like trying to make more of the DNA.
Is there error in that?
There's error, and it's also just extremely expensive.
I see,
And so you can actually do, so there is a company that has pioneered doing whole genome sequencing for the embryo, and it's called Orchid Health. They're incredible, but it's expensive. I think it's like $3,000 per embryo, or it might be slightly more or less. And
those costs are coming down. I know gene sequencing was $1 million a DNA string.
Now I think it's like 200 or something ridiculous, which is incredible. But for the cheaper end, I think there's a new machine come out that has brought it down yet again. But basically, I should explain. So basically, there is one way to do it, which is Orchid Health. They do a full genome sequence of the embryo. It's a patented way. I don't actually think anyone else is capable of it, and they have a sort of proprietary system. There's another company called Heresight, and they do the imputation method, which is the one that I described earlier. And so the imputation method, I think statistically it's kind of as good as the whole genome sequence, or maybe Orchid say that even though their system is potentially more expensive per embryo, they think that they can detect what's called de novo mutations, so single gene mutations in the genome, which you can't really do from the imputation method. So the imputation method, you're like, okay, it's this baby has inherited.
I see. You're actually looking at the parents' genomes and just how they've been mixed around, but you don't catch the what is it? I think it's like 30 base pairs get flipped per generation or something.
Yeah, something like that. And look, I think de novo mutations from memory, I think it's like 1 in 250 embryos have a dangerous de novo mutation, and so there's a question of like, is it if you have the money?
That's not very many.
It's not. Yeah, I've gone for the slightly cheaper option, and simply because I have so many embryos. I think 2,500 per, and so you'd say, oh, that's for the 50 embryos. Well, actually, in order to get 50 euploids, I had to get I think it was 70 like embryos, and then not all of them have the correct number of chromosomes.
Yeah. So let's talk then. About how accurately we can measure anything, because you've got this 99% accurate genome, let's say, And then we've got our statistical methodologies for predicting various things about that. Like, for example, you can predict IQ, you can predict height, you can predict eye color. So there's two sort of statistical variances we need to be aware of here. One is between the embryos, what is the real variance in any of these sort of dimensions of interest?
Yeah.
And the other is in your measurement, what's the actual error bars, what's the noise level? Because if you have relatively small amount of actual variation, relatively large amount of error, you're not actually selecting on anything. You're just rolling the dice, and you might as well just roll the dice the cheap way.
Yeah.
So why don't you give me a little bit more on how many standard deviations are we actually talking about in terms of variation between embryos and error bars on how accurately we can select things?
So the answer is that the predictability of different traits is hugely variable depending on what the trait is. We can pretty accurately predict what the height of the embryo is going to be, like the hair color, the eye color, that kind of thing.
Those ones are easy. Yeah.
Those ones are easy. There are certain, schizophrenia is more heritable, and so therefore easier to predict. Intelligence, and this is the controversial one, but the one I'm kind of excited about, is we can predict a little bit, but the predictors are not yet very good. And so I think the current predictors account for 20% of current variance, which is not a huge amount. But
not a huge amount.
So to put
and
that,
then how much variation is estimated to actually exist between the embryos?
For the you and I know different families with different siblings, and sometimes siblings are very close to each other, and sometimes you're like, I don't even realize that you people were related. Like, this is crazy. You can get a huge amount of spread between siblings. And so if you look, I've got my little thing on my computer that has my embryos, and they're plotted on a bell curve as to their predicted intelligence. And I think that there's 3 standard deviations of difference between the top one and the bottom one.
Yeah, but of course, those variations are multiplied by your error,
exactly.
right?
And so it's sort of
yeah.
But then if you look at some of the more predictable traits of height, it's also
I assume it would be similar actually in the variance. So what's the sort of measurable variance in height?
I actually don't know. I kind of have to go look it up.
Yeah, these seem like crucial numbers to me, because like if you had very large variation between siblings, well, first of all, heredity starts to mean a lot less, but then the selection becomes much more valuable, right? Whereas if the variation in intelligence is like, let's say you've got 10 embryos, 30 embryos, and like you're getting maybe 1 standard deviation or 2, or like, a standard, like the standard deviation of the embryos is 10 IQ points or something. It's like, okay, yeah, that's interesting, but can we measure it? You say it's 20%. 20. I don't know. I'm not as good enough at statistics to know exactly what that's going to mean in terms of the standard deviations, but like it does sound to me like, okay, now we're measuring mostly error, right?
Yeah.
And so this is, again, back to my argument. I remember last year, you and I and your father were talking about this. And,
bless my parents. They're so nice to me, and they sort of, I sort of tell my family about all this stuff, and they're like, "Oh, it's Rachel again with her crazy experiments."
Well, I mean, what I remember is your father was on my side, which is to say, we my wife was not pregnant at the time. You were not pregnant at the time. And I said, well, let's see who gets there first.
Yes.
And, my next child's going to be born at the end of May.
Well, you're going to make me jealous. Don't say that.
I have to hit you with this because it's important. Because, my analysis in this has been that, okay, you're getting a certain amount of selectability out of these things. But you're also delaying the process, right? And so it's like, okay, you're like, it may not be this bad, but it's like on average you're losing a kid for the sake of like increasing the variation, increasing the value of that remainder by some amount, right? And so the question is that worth it? And to me, my calculation again is like, you can even do all those calculations and show like, oh, it's going to be such and such variations. Well, I don't know that that's real. because again, this stuff's untested, right? It's like, even if you did all your math right, there's still unknown factors. And so it's
I would respond to
Yeah,
2
on.
points. And so the first one, I absolutely agree with you. And so I have also done the math, and I'm like, is this because I want a really big family?
Right.
And the audience is going, looking at me, you're no spring chicken. I am 32, and so perhaps starting at 32, if you want 8 children, is perhaps not the done thing.
Well, if you've got a lot of embryos, things
this
get easier.
This is the good news, is that my eggs and embryos are going to be in the freezer forever. And the good thing is that the womb does not age as badly as your eggs, basically. And so if you have the frozen embryos, you can continue to have children into your 40s. And there are women who successfully give birth through IVF using donor or frozen embryos in their 50s. And so
Going to have a harder time throwing them around, though.
And so this is the thing, is I'm like, okay, yes, I can technically have them. Will I have enough energy? And that is something I do worry about. And so I would have ideally liked to have started earlier. I think I remember at the moment extremely distinctly of I was on a ski field when I was 19, and I met this woman, and she was there with her tiny 4-week-old daughter, and I just completely forgot about the ski field, and we just spent the next couple of hours talking about how perfect her daughter was, and I just thinking, I would love a baby right now.
And it took you another 10 or 12 years to actually make that happen.
It's really hard to date in the modern world.
No,
it was
it is.
literally
It's tough.
like finding my husband was just, and I had to literally, it was continents, like hemispheres to find him. And so now we're here, and it's incredible. But maybe things work out. If we'd met when we were 20 and started having children, we wouldn't have probably made use of this technology. Or maybe we would have. Maybe we would have ended up with 20 children as opposed to 8, and that I think would have been amazing. But these things happen. So yes, I agree with you that you don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and it is possible to fall into neuroticism with this.
This has been my other criticism of this stuff, is like reproductive technology generally is new ways to be neurotic about having children.
Yeah.
We have many ways to be neurotic about having children. Many people are totally wrapped up in that, not having kids, having excuses, delaying it, getting worried about it, stressing themselves out, like over-optimizing, and just totally failing as a result. And so this is what I don't want to see, right? Yeah. I want to see like good people who are into this stuff and like have this sort of forward-thinking, take responsibility for life, love life kind of people. I want those people to have more children.
I agree.
I want them to have more high-quality children.
Yeah.
But we have to weigh all the costs. Yeah. And so like when I stack up all these costs, right, it's like, okay, there's the cost in time and number you're going to maybe be able to have. Again, unproven. Are you really going to be able to have 8? Well, we'll see. These are these experiments that we have to actually roll. And then there's like, do you get as good a selective result such that it's worth doing that versus just getting a bunch of embryos or getting fewer embryos faster and just implanting those ones if you were even going to do IVF at all.
Yeah.
And then there's this whole aspect of kind of like all these extra moral variables, all these extra kind of like ways that this affects the community. You're saying maybe everyone shouldn't do this. It's not for everyone. A few people should do this. But how does that affect kind of the moral backbone of your community in any way? Like, we do. To some extent, I discount most of that sort of thinking. It's usually a bunch of superstition. On the other hand, like there is something real to, moms have to kind of be able to relate to each other. It has to not be too weird, like to help each other out and so on. There's something there, right?
Absolutely. And I've just I had a conversation with a woman, and I was sort of blabbing on about embryo selection, being like, it's so exciting, we're going to be able to eradicate genetic disease, and it's going to be so wonderful for the world. And then she was sort of like, oh, well, this is wonderful. And she also had her little toddler tottering around in the background. And she sort of asked the elephant in the room, of like, well, what about the unselected ones? Like, do you love them as much as the selected ones? And I think my response to that is, every baby is a blessing, and they're all fabulous, selected or not.
Yeah.
And look, I'm doing all of this crazy stuff to get an extra, hopefully 7 or 8 IQ points per child or something. And the outs.
We'll see if that works.
We'll see if that works. But like Terence Tao, if he was doing embryo selection, his worst embryos would probably be more intelligent than my best ones.
The key thing with people like Terence Tao is like, this is another big argument here, right? It's like, okay, if we're ultimately trying to increase the number of good people having good children, overwhelmingly what matters is not the like marginal gains or losses in the individual families or in the individual parents.
It's everyone having fabulous big families.
It's people like Terrence Tao having big families with lots of spares, so that good things are going to go wrong.
Yeah.
And that's, again, this is my old-fashioned style sort of reproductive planning, generational planning as well. Let's just have a bunch of children the old way and let God sort it out.
And look, I think that there's absolutely a good argument for that. Something that does weigh on me is a little bit is sort of the dynamics of judgment among people. And as much as I say like, oh, like it's not for everyone and this is just my choice, like simply me existing, suddenly like the fact that there is an option means that there is another aspect of judgment for people.
Yeah, there's things. Yeah, people can be judged like, oh, you did it the old way, or oh, you did it this weird way. And like people, and this is what I'm getting at with like kind of this fabric of the community. Again, it's a little bit of a superstitious concern, but also there's something real to people being able to relate to each other, and like how do we
navigate?
It's good to have a lot of unity, right? And it's good to have a lot of commonality. And on the other hand, I mean, individuality is also like wonderful, and like let's have lots of experiments. So that one's a tough one. I'm not going to fall hard on either side, but I'm aware of it as a definitely like a source of friction.
It's so funny because like I'm Aspergery enough that when people initially brought up the fact to me, they're like, oh well, like isn't it sort of, are you concerned about the fact that this emerging technology means that there's going to be pressure on people to use it? Like probably not now, but once it becomes more powerful, is that a concern of yours? And I was originally like kind of why would you ask me that? And the reason why is because when I do the cost benefit analysis in my head, it's like, yes, it's a true cost of people being pressured into like what is now quite a difficult process, but that is completely outweighed of once the technology becomes good enough to the benefits of the child. And so I'm like, why are you even bringing this up? And the reason I say that I think that was a sort of an autistic misunderstanding is because I think when people bring that up, they're not asking you to do the purely logical cost-benefit analysis. It's more like they're saying, like, have you thought about this? Like,
are you judging me for this right now?
Yeah. And all I can say is that I, like, personally, I love experimentation, and I'm like, look, live and let live. Everyone has different crazy experimental lives. Look, you and I live in the Bay Area. We have friends who are polyamorous and friends who are, look, I love my poly friends. We have people who are like crazy right-wing hippies and trans cat girls, and it's just like, we kind of live in a kind of live and let live. I mean, and it's kind of cool.
For the record, there's a lot of wackos in the Bay Area. I mean, most people are insane. I have a hard time relating to anybody.
Most new experiments don't work. It's like, but I'm still glad that there are people out here experimenting with new ways of life. But at the same time, just to say like, I don't judge anyone is not to say that other people, and like I literally talking to my cousin about this, and she was just like, oh my God, Rachel, what are you doing? And I'm just like, what do you mean?
Right,
and she's
like, what are you doing?
she's just like, because she's a mother, and she was like, you have no idea when you become a mother, literally every decision that you make is scrutinized and judged. Are you a working mother versus a stay-at-home mother? Are you doing attachment parenting versus authoritative parenting?
But at some level you have to just not care about that.
Yeah, and eventually
you have to say like, no, you know what? I'm going to do it my way. You're going to have to call the cops.
Yeah, exactly.
That's our attitude for the most part.
But and so
I want to quibble with something you said, which is people experimenting with new ways of living, and I question whether any of these ways of living are actually ways of living. Like in the sense, are they in fact viable? Do they actually produce further life?
Yes.
And not just, there's a lot of experiments, there's a lot of rolling the dice, but even the general veneration of experimental living that happens around here in California. I think California has a pretty bad record in terms of like the actual preserving any actual way of living, or never mind preserving, just do you preserve life, right? Like does California a generation, 2 generations ago was like absolute paradise in terms of the people. I think the people have gotten a lot more questionable, let's say, in California. You know, a lot of wackos moved in from all over the world, you know, and now it's like, is this even a viable society? Like, are we just kind of deluding ourselves by being here? Like, these are real questions, and it's like, again, there's actually these major costs in doing this experimentation. You're drawing on an implicit subsidy of kind of functionality from somewhere else.
Okay, that's fair.
And like, so I think part of our responsibility, if we are taking full responsibility for the thing, is also to go and maintain or like figure out how to defend that core trunk of what actually is going to work. Yeah. And so that's sort of where I stand in these things, is like, what's the thing that's actually the core of our civilization, of our society, or of, you know, somewhat more open-minded, assume our civilization died sometime in the 20th century. Like, what even is viable for life in the future? And like, and so, you know, in that scenario, what I'm looking at is much more like, what are the things we can absolutely rely on? What are the things that are essential to preserve? And that's where I'm like, okay, let's just have a lot of children. We'll do it the old-fashioned way. I don't trust the medical system. I don't want to be entangled with all that. Minimize institutional contact in my life is my general strategy. And, you know, it works out for me to some extent.
So one thing I would say is I think that this is really getting down to brass tacks. And so I think with my understanding of evolution, I think that there's a common understanding of evolution or of the state of nature that say animals live in this state of like constant pressure. Like, you have to be like optimized and as good as possible in order to survive.
Yeah, that's not quite true.
That's not quite true. Like, the majority of wild animals most of the time are like, I wouldn't say their lives are leisurely, but it's not like there's a huge amount of pressure. However, there are usually moments in their lives where there's basically catastrophe. And so I think that this is the thing about civilization, is that we have smoothed out the catastrophes of life. You know, famine, war, plague. Like, if you're a lion in the savannah and there's a drought, like, suddenly life gets really real, and you can basically just be wiped out in an instant. Anyway, so what I'm saying is that there's a lot of room for basically diversity in the animal kingdom. It's like, you know, you do see examples of animals who are like maybe a little bit wobbly in some way, but like still manage to like get along and they're mostly fine. There's a story on TikTok.
There's even more people who are pretty wobbly but get along.
Humans as well.
I think maybe far too many. You know, we subsidize a lot of experiments, let's say.
But so there's a leopard on TikTok who I'm absolutely obsessed with, and she's known as the girl fail leopard, and so like she's being watched by these naturalists, and she's just like, you know, she kind of like refused to grow up, and she just like kept making her like mother like provide food for her until her mother actually just left, and then she had to like figure out hunting on her own. And it's like watching her like go through life, but she's like kind of figuring it out. But it was so funny, all the comments are sort of like, oh my god, she's just like me for real, and like she, you know, failure to launch. But I was like kind of like, it's amazing to see.
Why is that what we're identifying with, though?
This
is a bad sign.
But, so why am I going off on this tangent about leopards? My point is that I think if animals had to be completely narrowly optimized for survival and reproduction, there wouldn't be any really room for variation. And so it's actually very important that animals are not over-optimized in one direction, but instead there's like a certain amount of diversity. And there's also a sort of an understanding that perhaps a lot of adaptions that eventually become very important start off as something perhaps a little bit deleterious.
They start off as something quite wacky.
Like, you can imagine, okay, so we have life develops in the oceans, and then it goes into the land, and then some of the land dwelling animals go back into the ocean. And you can imagine the proto, like dolphins are an example of this. And so they came from ones that were on the land. You can imagine the first proto-dolphin was maybe like a little land-dwelling animal that had like slightly webbed feet, and maybe all of the other like
did a lot of splashing around in the water.
Yeah, and all of the other animals are like that doesn't seem right. It makes life a lot harder to have like little webbed toes or something. But like actually they were like, you know, they're functional enough. Maybe he was a charismatic in other ways, and the other like weird proto-dolphins. You know, and so
the most interesting fact about dolphins and whales and so on is the most closely related land animals, like cows.
Oh, what? Cows? I thought it was elephants.
They're actually ungulates.
What?
Whales are ungulates.
That's so
anyway,
weird.
Random trivia.
Yeah, but so my point is that I think it's like you don't want to over-optimize, and I think it's good to have all of these experimentation. But
I'll give the other point, the other side on that argument, which is, now in history, or since the sort of 20th century, are we overinvested in the fundamentals of life, or are we overinvested in the weird wacko experiments?
Yes.
And I think the answer is very clear. I think we're overinvested in wacko experiments, like ways of deviating. We have had, since especially the 1960s, this faith in society that the old way is not going to work for us. The old way doesn't need to be preserved. We can just ignore all of that and go do our free love, wacky, like technology experiment things. We can just totally subsidize all the weird stuff in society, all the people who aren't really making things working. And it seems to me, actually, we're stacking up an enormous amount of, like, let's call it civilizational debt or something. And it's not a good place to be. This is why I want to see more good children from good people. Like this seems to be the fundamentals, right?
Yeah.
Like let's get the fundamentals in order here.
I think that is, as well as me being like, I think it's great to have a diversity of different experiments, and so hopefully the ones that are the most successful will eventually go on and reproduce themselves. And I also think that your talk about civilizational debt is true, and it's true that you can run down the sort of the wealth and treasure of past generations that they built up, and eventually just be sort of in a decaying society.
Until you hit one of those catastrophes, right? And when it all the chickens come home to roost, so to speak.
But look, I think that our civilization is facing many extremely complex issues, which is all the more reason a little bit more intelligence could be good for the world. And look, if you care about things,
if it works.
If it works. Getting back to this, does it work? So the cool thing about this technology is it's pretty reasonably easy to verify. So what you can do is you'll have a bunch of matched phenotype, genotype gene sets that you keep out of the training data. And then you say, okay, we've built our predictor. We want to predict people's intelligence from their genomes. You go back to this set of genotype, phenotype data, and then you make predictions, and then you can see if you were correct. So it's like a relatively easy thing to check. And so I think that when they say the number of like 20% of it is predictable, I think that is probably very accurate. Having said that, each individual is going to be, it's just a bit of a toss-up of how accurate it's going to be, obviously.
Yeah, and as an engineer, I was trained as an engineer. I'm very amenable to like doing the calculations, trying to see like how does the out of the numbers actually come out, and chase these things like, oh, this calculation looks like it's actually viable. Let's go and pursue that. On the other hand, the other big thing you learn as an engineer is that nothing's real until you're testing it.
Yeah.
Right. And because you've always forgotten something, there's always these difficulties that you don't foresee, but
like you can test the predictors on adults, and so like they gave
you can test the predictors, but like, are you applying the predictors properly in this particular context? Have you missed some key factor? Like, what's going to happen with all this extra machinery in there? It's like you need to demonstrate the technology, right?
Yeah,
Which is this is why I'm excited about what you're doing at some level. Of course, I'd like you to have more children sooner, so that our kids can be friends. But I mean, this is the source of all my caution in these things. Is like, there is an old way that does just work, and people are totally underinvested in that, relative to I think how much we should be. So I'm gonna continue with the old way, and I hope to see other people also catch up on this.
Yes, and look, I think you and I agree on this. I love kids. I think kids are wonderful. I think they're amazing for ourselves individually. I think being a parent is this incredible spiritual experience. I think that having more children around in a civilizational sense is a good thing. I think the ratio of young people to old people is actually really underrated.
There's more dogs than children in this city, for example, which is very tragic.
It is very upsetting. And so I do sort of look around, like many of my highly intelligent, highly successful friends in the Bay Area, and they're going like, oh, like, do we, when are we going to have kids? Do we even want kids? And I'm like, what are you doing?
People come to me and they're like, oh, well, if you're doing such an interesting countercultural like experiment, I'm like, bro. This is the basics. You guys are not going to make it. What are you doing?
I do really admire you and your wife, and that people are like, oh, I don't know, you can't have, like, having a kid in the Bay Area is expensive and difficult, and you're like, it's actually not. You're totally optimizing for the wrong thing in terms of like status and wealth and like the next master's degree. You've already got 4, and you're just like, it's not worth it. You're being misled. And it's so funny because with all of this stuff of me saying like, oh, I don't want to be judgmental of people, and then me being like, actually I do judge people for not having children. I think that is the only aspect on which I judge my friends, and it's not like me being like they're bad people. It's like, you are awesome. I want to see more of you. Have babies.
Like be connected to reality in that way. Anyways, I think we've been going on for quite a ways here, and we've covered most of what I think is the interesting material here. So if you have any further tangents to go on, or more angles on this, like, should we engage in, high-tech selection methods for making the next generation better? What's your final case?
I should have bought a notepad, because like everything you say, I'm like, oh yeah, I'll come back to that, and I've forgotten so much of the stuff. But like in terms of things, one thing I would get back to is this idea of like how much of this is a danger to your children actually. Polygenic embryo screening is not any more dangerous than doing regular IVF, and I don't think that there are actually any dangers of doing IVF. So when IVF was sort of originally around, there was some studies that came out, and they were like, oh, like maybe IVF children are slightly less healthy on average than the regular children.
Natural
children. But and it turns out that it's always selection effects, and basically if you
there's a lot of selection effects in these things.
Yeah, and so like if you and your partner are slightly unhealthier, it's generally fertility is highly linked to general health, and so like if you're slightly unhealthier, you're more likely to want to do IVF, and actually when you account for that, it turns out that the entire IVF process doesn't really have an effect on the kids. And so polygenic embryo screening, I don't actually think that I'm experimenting on my kids in a way that it would actually cause them harm, apart from the psychological effects that we've discussed earlier, which is definitely something that I think about.
And even that, like I would say, I sort of doubt that's even causal. I think some people, for whatever reason, become resentful, and they attach themselves to whatever
is in their
reason for that is around.
Yeah, but that's not to say that the sort of other technologies in the pipeline, which I'm also excited about, they do carry some sort of risks. And so we can talk about polygenic embryo selection and how powerful it is. And right now it's basically limited by, I think, our data sets. And so if we had more data, you would hopefully be able to do better predictors and more high quality data as well.
Where does that data come from?
Mostly the UK is the world leader in sort of providing these data sets. There's the All of Us data set and the UK Biobank. And so this is another issue with this entire thing, is that most of our data sets are actually sort of tend towards people of English, Anglo, UK descent. And if I'm going to,
which is good for you, of course.
It's great for me. But if I'm going to lib out for a second, I do care about everyone being able to access the technology, and I'm like, I do think that it would be a wonderful thing. It's something I'm thinking about doing, is potentially going out into the world and getting more data from basically all ethnic groups.
Comprehensive, compulsory genome sequencing of everyone in the world.
Not compulsory, but more just being like, I want people to have access to this technology if they want it, and I'd love more ethnic groups sort of in the mix. But the data sets we have are, they're all right. They're not particularly good. So
how are they selected? Like, what are they approaching random people and saying, I want your genome? Like, how does this? Where do they actually do these phenotype inspections and the genotype inspections?
I don't know. That's something that I should look into. Is it college students? It's always college students. There is quite a large data set of the Million Veterans Project, and so that is in the US.
Military,
and so that's military recruitment, and they do a battery of tests of general health, but they also administer an IQ test. This data set is currently not available, and it would be like, if we could get access to it, it would
we should send a note to our friends in the government.
Yes, and be like, please, this would this would really contribute to a healthier, brighter, smarter next generation. Like, if you would let us use it for the technology.
Please release this information, somewhat anonymized, maybe.
Oh, absolutely, as anonymized as humanly possible. But like the stuff from the UK Biobank, what we call the IQ test that is associated with that is like not very good. I think it's like only a certain number of questions, and so it would be wonderful to get more better data with like large-scale IQ tests, high-read genome sets, and then that would make the technology more powerful. But once you have better predictors, it opens you up to the possibility of, so to go through a list of the technology stack that could potentially come into the future. So there is a thing called IVG, which is in vitro gametogenesis, which is where you can take any cell, like a skin cell, turn it back into a pluripotent stem cell, turn those stem cells into gametes, so sperm and egg.
But of course, this has much more error potential in it because the non-gamete cells accumulate mutations faster.
So I talked before about why it is that men's tend to accumulate more mutagenic load in their gametes as opposed to women, and it's because the cells that produce the eggs are the slowest life cycle, like whatever it's called, cell rotation cells in the entire body. And that is extremely important because you're trying to have as few cell divisions as possible, so you introduce
you want to
as
preserve as much as possible.
And so if you're getting your eggs from a skin cell, it's possible that you have more mutational load.
Yeah, you just got a skin cancer cell.
Yes, which would be bad. But sort of like there are ways around this, and so IVG currently does work in mice. So I talked to a researcher who's working on this, and he's like, we are quite capable of creating what he calls mouse caviar. So basically just an abundance of mouse eggs.
I see.
And if we could do that for humans, suddenly you're not talking about selection from 50 embryos. It's essentially infinity embryos, and you could get quite a lot of selection from there. There is also the possibility of you could do multiple generations of selection in a petri dish. And so how this would work is that you would take a skin cell, turn it into eggs and sperm, and then combine it hopefully with another person because you don't want inbreeding, into a new embryo, and then turn that embryo back into a stem cell that you could then turn into eggs and sperm. And so you would need a lot of input in terms of parents in the initial generation, so you don't get inbreeding, but you could essentially do like 100 or 1,000 generations of selection in a petri dish.
Well, I wonder if you could do, actually this inbreeding stuff is very interesting because if you imagine Adam and Eve as being genetically perfect at some level, inbreeding would not have been a problem for them because they don't have the threat of homozygous deleterious mutations, because if there aren't any deleterious mutations,
then you're fine.
And so maybe this iterated embryo selection stuff, which is I think what you're talking about there, I guess the fact that it involves this inbreeding problem, actually I hadn't thought about, but that means that it would have to be developed alongside, or if it were to be done in sort of the obvious couple-focused way, would have to be developed alongside some sort of technology for wiping out those deleterious mutations.
The good news is you wouldn't really need a new technology because it's like you literally will just not use that embryo, and so you're like, oh, this one got two of it, and so you just don't use it.
This is actually the old way. People report things like Ramses being like exceptionally healthy and strong and like intelligent.
Really?
Yeah. So some of the Egyptian pharaohs
were Cleopatra famously was inbred and also apparently very intelligent.
Right. And this is the interesting thing about inbreeding is that it doesn't add problems, it reveals problems. And so now most people tend to have a lot of problems, so it's generally not a good idea to inbreed. But in certain, I think, historical circumstances, there have been highly inbred lineages that also were very healthy because they've purified themselves by wiping out all the really deleterious mutations are gone because they've gone through that process. So if you do this artificially in an embryo selection context, that's a very interesting possibility, I guess.
There's literally a phrase for it, which is purifying selection, which is exactly what you've described. That if you have a slightly inbred population, they're like under more intense pressure because obviously you're going from however many % healthy offspring to much lower than that, that puts a lot of pressure on the population. But if you manage to survive however many generations, eventually you get a kind of purified mix at the bottom, which has been the sort of bad deleterious stuff has been.
They've gone through that crucible, and I think also they're more likely to be distinct from the original populations. Like this is where you get new species and so on from as well.
Exactly, and so this is a sort of a weird part of polygenic embryo selection is like technically it does make sort of inbreeding more feasible. I'm not sure anyone would actually want to do that, but if you do want to Targaryen Max.
But even if you like, without getting into the sort of social implications of that, the fact that even just iterated embryo selection among a single couple is effectively an incestuous process.
If you started off with only two people,
Yeah, and like that's an interesting. It's an interesting problem to overcome because you would need like some technical solution to that to do that. I guess you can do the like population level. You know, you get 100 people together. This is starting to get socially very weird.
Very, very
where
weird.
It's like I'm going to get 100 men and 100 women,
and then
specially selected for being handsome and intelligent and whatnot, and then we're going to do this very strange 100 generations of selection and mutation inside of this test tube crucible, and out the other side after 100 generations comes some like improved set of children who no longer bear any particular parental relationship to these particular people. Like that's
the future.
It sounds like something out of Plato, right?
The future is going to get exceptionally weird. And like, if there are any aspiring sci-fi authors out there, I like basically looking into reproductive technology is like such a fertile ground for different sci-fi scenarios, because there's this one.
Actually, this is a perfect. I mean, yeah. Speaking of sci-fi, like if I was going to go write a sci-fi story, this is how Plato's Republic should work. The big breeding festival. But you always have this problem, which is like some of the children actually are more related to some of the parents. And so if you do the breeding festival as this like iterated mixture thing overseen by the philosopher kings doing the selective breeding, out the other side comes a generation that's actually like 100 generations removed from the parental generation and is thoroughly mixed among them, but also thoroughly optimized. It would make good sci-fi.
Absolutely. And Wolf is going to come out and be like, finally, I have created the breeding festival from Plato's famous work, Do Not Create the Breeding Festival.
Well, his famous work was you should create the breeding festival.
But so that's one technology. And another one which we call is called chromosome selection, otherwise colloquially known as the polycule baby, which is where you...
multiple parents.
Specifically multiple fathers, because as you may be aware, it is a lot easier to get sperm than it is eggs.
Right.
And so basically what you would do is, if you can find a way to be able to separate the chromosomes from each other, you could potentially like get a group of like 26 men and be like, all right, you've got the best chromosome 11 and you've got the best chromosome 12, and put them together. And
this is what Nick Land meant by a relapse into bacterial sex.
Yeah, because you're getting, what are the bacteria they do? I forget the phrase, but they swap.
Yeah, bacteria do lateral genodata transfer,
right.
as he puts it in Meltdown.
I'm not sure if the world is quite ready for the baby with 26 fathers.
No, I mean, it's truly a strange new world out there if you follow these technologies.
To their conclusion. Okay, so we've got IVG, we've got chromosome selection. What are the next ones? Obviously, there's good old-fashioned genome editing.
Right.
And so that one has the potential to be the most powerful of all of them, because you're literally changing individual genomes. And say if we had...
Right, where you have opinions about, this gene, we want this or this slot, we want this gene.
And you could create, we get very excited about...
The designer babies,
Yeah, we get very excited if a person's like 145 IQ, but with this technology, you could potentially, 200, 300. At that point, like if it suddenly there was a breakthrough tomorrow and we were like, incredibly, someone's been working on this. We can now do amazing gene editing without any off targets, and we can create somebody who's potentially 300 IQ. I am a huge experimenter, and I'm very excited about our sci-fi future. I think at that point it might be good to be like, maybe we should try the 200 IQ person first and see how that looks.
Well, the other thing I'll bring up in that context is this is where this feedback loop between worldview and social system and reproduction becomes especially important. As we get more fine-grained control, we need to be a lot wiser about what we're doing, because we're no longer able to rely on the wisdom of nature.
And so this
is so for example, if we imagine widespread deployment of that technology, during the hysteria of 2020, I can imagine terrible things would have happened to our genetic stock, right? If like you suddenly get everyone super hopped up about like, we have to eliminate the racism genes, you know, and like it's like that's you're gonna start doing these targeted edits on hysterical moral fashions that like now that if you look at that, what is that process? That's a like runaway out of control nonsense process that you absolutely cannot allow near your fundamentals, and like the fundamentals have to be by nature way more conservatively treated, and so as we get more power in these things, it actually becomes even more important to become more conservative about them, because we are in fact standing on a tower of preservation of a tradition. Like if you see the blood, like the genes as a tradition, almost a literary tradition, you know, there's things written down in there, right?
Yes.
We have preserved inheritance from 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, 40,000 years ago, that there's absolutely no cultural transmission, right, across those kinds of timescales. But there is genetic transmission across those kinds of timescales. And in other words, the genetic process is vastly more conservative than the cultural process, which means that insofar as there's any necessity for like a conservatism within society, preserving what is working, a lot of that rests in preserving of inheritance genetically. And so when you start messing with that stuff and you apply high-speed cultural fashions to what is in fact this like very old substrate that we were relying on being very old, civilizations are going to be able to erase themselves quite quickly. Like if you imagine the Romans didn't just collapse culturally, they also like
collapsed genetically, which
they did to some extent.
It could have been
but like
worse.
they could, you know, leave a genetic crater the likes of which has been never seen, you know.
And I completely agree with you. And so we're getting into the area of reproductive technology that personally scares me the most, and it kind of gets to our last reproductive tech is womb tanks. And it's funny that was the one that I'm the most like tentative about, because people are like, well, surely it's not messing with the genomes. It just means that women don't have to go through pregnancy.
No, but it totally alienates the human from the reproductive process. It's a totally new species, right? It's like we're no longer the same kind of animal.
And the thing that I worry about the most is the role of the state in being able to choose peoples. And so if
and the state is not actually a very conservative institution.
The state is not a conservative institution, and I don't think it cares as much about its underlings as parents do. And so what the womb tank would allow is for a state to essentially finally get rid of the nuclear family, which I think they've been trying to do, at least some of them, for a while now.
And the thing to notice is that this is actually a self-destructive drive.
It is.
Because it has not been able to do that, it has gotten away with having those impulses, right? And like, so if you imagine the modern institutions, you know, the bureaucracy, the state, the shareholder corporation, like getting unleashed on the internet cult, you know, getting unleashed on these fundamental matters of genetics. That's the thing that scares me the most. Or like the insanity lies that way.
You sort of think back to the early communists who were extremely invested in creating the new man. They literally called it the new man. Imagine if they could actually create the new man.
Yeah, and you read some of the more speculative extents of what they meant by the new man. Some of them were like, the new man will be made out of replaceable parts in a factory, you know, it will be totally commoditized and abstracted, and there will be nothing, like you can replace the arms and the legs, you can replace the body, you can replace the brain, like, you know, it's like they're imagining sort of this, now this is some crazy cosmists, right, you know, Russian cosmism, but like that stuff actually becomes plausible when in these technological extremes. And so I think the development of technology is wonderful. The advancement of life is wonderful. As we get more power in these things, we have to be taking more care of the fundamentals. And it's like similarly in the multicellular organism, there's parts of the organism that are specialized in preserving the genome, right? And we consider the rest of the body disposable. And there's parts that are, like you say, with the egg stem cells, right? They're much more conservative. They don't reproduce as fast. They do not mutate as fast. And we have to become more like that as a society. We have to become much more conservative about some certain fundamentals. It's almost like the correct stance towards it is almost that, like, the blood is a revelation from God. We don't want to touch it too much.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's interesting to take more responsibility for that, but I think there's going to be some amount of recognition, in the limit, there's some amount of recognition that there are inheritances there, there's wisdom there beyond our own ability to mess with. And if we mess with it, we're just going to get whacked.
I think, like, taking responsibility for things is not simply being careless and being like, oh, like, come what may. It's actually about...
Yeah, it's not just I'm responsible, like Claude, where it's like, whoops, I deleted your files. I guess I'm responsible for that.
Sorry. It's like, no, it's like thinking about the worst possible outcomes and being like, could I live with this? Could I sleep with this? Am I taking the appropriate steps to prevent the worst possible outcomes? There's also a question of how do you know what is worth preserving? And I have
and this is actually epistemically a very deep question.
And look, this might be a naive way of looking at things, but I often think about the vectors of history. And I'm like, one of the things that is so exciting about genomic prediction is that we can potentially make our children better, but it also gives us greater insight into our forebears, because you can look at ancient genomes and be like, what were their schizophrenia risks? How tall were they?
Now we have these wonderful graphs. Like, have you seen the one of European intelligence over time, where I think like 10,000 years ago with the arrival of the farmers, you get this massive increase of intelligence.
And then the Yamnaya take over, and it's like, whoa, and then
wipes things out for a while.
And then the last 1,000 years have been like, a straight shot sort of up.
Well, actually, I mean, I think what happened was there was a big increase in intelligence during the sort of corded ware era, which is like 1,000 years after the Yamnaya invasions. And then it's more ups and downs in the sort of civilized era.
But it's so that stuff I absolutely love it. I love ancient genomes. It's one of my favorite things to talk about. But I also look to it for wisdom, because I'm like, what have we been selected for over that long period of time?
Right.
And there's classic stuff of what are the biggest differences between you and me and our forebears 10,000 years ago.
Right.
And there's obvious stuff like there's been a lot of change in immune coding stuff. And there's a question of like, are our immune systems actually getting better, or it's like there's a constant arms race between us and pathogenic disease, and so you always have to be like on the forefront of immunological change. We've probably gotten a little bit taller as more resources became more available, but then there's this particular one of intelligence increases over time, and so
somewhat. Again, last 2,000-3,000 years, a little bit ups and downs. I think the sort of dark age the coming out of the dark age was sort of fairly beneficial. Going into the dark age was fairly bad. Yes. The modern era, I think we had been going up for a little while there. I think we're starting to go back down.
And I agree, but it's interesting. It's like the stock market, where you're just sort of like, okay, there are ups and downs, but it's interesting that there's a trend upwards. And so I
at the long time scale.
On the long time scale. And I'm like, I think this makes sense with my intuition of, I think that intelligence is so anti-fragile. Like the more intelligent a person is, and look, there are things called like autist traps, where you can have like this big brain and it gets like distracted into a crazy area.
Just to address the kind of stereotypes around intelligence, I think one of the big drivers of those stereotypes, the actual fact is that intelligence is correlated with everything good. Yeah. One of the drivers of the stereotypes is that any given level of social stratification, like a school or a city or an industry, like where or any kind of class where you're associating with people of similar social value to yourself, which is usually what happens. What you get is this big spread where at one end you have people who are there because of incredible athletic ability or charisma or handsomeness or whatever, and there are thereby probably a lot dumber, because if they were smarter, they'd be in the next level up, right?
It's sort of funny
And then
because you're
on the
like,
other
oh,
end-
like I look around all my friends and they're, high IQ, but like a lot of them have ADHD or other
Yeah,
issues.
yeah,
And you're like,
although-
why is that? And you're just like, well, because if they didn't have those things, they'd probably be running the world. Like,
Yeah, and there are people who are like that, who
Yeah.
are above them, right? And at the other end, you have all your intelligent people. They're super smart. They know all this stuff, and they're total spurgs. They're unathletic, and this is not because there's actually
A correlation.
between those on the bulk level. It's because you are living in a selection effect.
Yeah.
And
That's
so
totally
it's a
true.
very important thing to note with respect to kind of stereotypes of what intelligence means.
It's so funny when people talk about this sort of stuff and they say like, like we can select for intelligence, but obviously intelligence isn't all there is, and like we shouldn't get. I think we underestimate how awesome intelligence is, and like how cool it is, and I'm so excited to hopefully be able to give my kids more of it. I see intelligence as a divine fire, and it exists within all of us. For some of us, it's a spark. For others, it's a raging inferno. And I want to see more of it.
More of it, yeah. I mean, at some level, intelligence is like an abstracted form of life, right? Like life itself is sort of this somewhat intelligent process that seeks out the opportunity in the world, and then now we imagine that kind of abstracted into the realm of information, and that's intelligence. And someone put it well, actually, the other day. I saw on Twitter, I think. Intelligence is almost by definition insensitivity to initial conditions, because it's like intelligence seeks out the opportunity regardless of where it starts.
Yeah, that's a good point. And just thinking in terms of my own life, I've gotten so much joy out of the life of the mind and studying philosophy and math at university, and I was like, this is fantastic. And then getting to a point at university where I'm like, wow, the math is starting to become really hard. Like, I think I might be topping out here. And so I'm so excited to be able to like look at my babies and be like, look, I was able to go so far. And
they're gonna go beyond us, right?
Yeah,
that's the ideal as parents, is we want our children to go beyond us. We want to, what is it? Nietzsche says we want to throw the spear of mankind beyond ourselves, right?
And that's the thing that really excites me. And it's so funny because my husband and I sometimes talk about what if some of the stronger technology becomes available, and we're able to have children who are, not just like 7 IQ points above us, but like 30 or 40, and we're like, how
again, I start to caution with the conservatism there, because 30 or 40 IQ points per generation is like total revolution per generation.
Yeah,
that's not sustainable.
And I'm just
we do not have the preservation frameworks in place for like how to have any kind of continuity across that.
I do think you're right there. But also just in terms of what revolution would look like on the scale of the family, what would it be like to raise a child who has like 30 extra IQ points than you? And I'm sure that those relationships has existed.
They would in fact figure it out. I guess I'm more worried about, you're massively increasing the intelligence, but you may be starting to Goodhart law, like chasing off some cliff.
Yeah,
on the other hand, it is going to revolutionize society every generation. So they're probably not running whatever initial idea you had after a generation of that.
But I think that the good ending for me is to be, on my deathbed surrounded by my many children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren are just like absolutely giga-brained, and they're just like,
they're just better than us.
They're just like, oh, poor old grandma, but like it's amazing what she was able to do with the intelligence that she had.
She was the little lunged fish that crawled out of the water.
Literally. And you just be like, it's amazing what she did, even though, she was not selected, and like we're eternally thankful to her, and we're going to go off into the universe and do like absolutely crazy stuff, which I can't imagine.
Yeah, no, I share this dream. I am just perhaps more cautious about what it looks like in practice. Anyways, well, why don't we end it there then?
No.
We could go on forever. Why don't we do it next time?
Yes.
Then?
Okay. Round two.
But I think this has been a great conversation. It's been great to have you on, Rachel.
Me too.
And I'm excited for where all this can go. I'm excited to meet your children finally. Let us exercise appropriate caution and ambition in these things.
Hell yes. Thank you so much for having me, Wolf.
Cheers.